I'm currently playing through Discord. This is happening while the others are playing. First time I ever play Curse of Strahd, but we have one player who already went through it, and he's like, "Oh, I love this part," or "Oh, don't touch anything," to where even if the DM says, "Hey, the game is a bit homebrewed," he'll go, "Oh, I know, but..." And I'm kind of getting burnt out and tired of playing with this guy. We just arrived to an old lady's house, but my character doesn't suspect a thing. But the way he is talking out of game, we kinda already know she's a witch, so I think it kinda killed the surprise or the twist. I'm sincerely thinking of bailing from this game since this is very much a nuisance. And he always complains when things are off the script and constantly spoils what's going to happen. I had a guy exactly like this, and at that time, I had no idea what fun he got out of spoiling the game for everyone. I still don't know what fun someone gets for spoiling something for everyone. Stop doing that. Seriously, quit it. So I started GMing a game in like February or March of this year and made what I now realize was a mistake of inviting the weird kid from my original high school to join in. He is not only weird as hell, but also borderline narcissistic, and is incapable of seeing things from other people's points of view or admitting that he is the one in the wrong. He has some serious entitlement issues to boot. Whenever people are upset with him or tell him they don't want him to do something, he thinks they are being completely unreasonable. He is always the one in the right, and everyone would just be better off if they just went along and did it his way. It wasn't so much as long as I am having fun, I don't care if others aren't having fun. It was more like, everyone will have more fun if we do it my way. He also would have some really weird ideas nobody else understood or liked, and would continue to push forward with them long after everyone else had told him to stop. Oh, and if more than 5 minutes went by where he hadn't said anything, he would interrupt me while I was in the middle of role-playing with another player to try and have his character do something. Basically, he was an absolute basket case nightmare, and in retrospect, I should have kicked him about 2 months ago. He is, even if he doesn't mean to be, a jerk. The only reason I didn't kick him is because whenever he was called out on his issues, he always promised he would do better next time. And I think he legitimately did want to do better, but every single time, nothing actually changed. It was just empty promise after empty promise to stop being disruptive. I apologize for how long this post is, but this player just did so many absolutely ridiculous things that I could not pick just one, nor could I ignore any of them. Now, to get to the details. Our party had the following players during the height of the issues: Gnome Artificer, male; High Elf Cleric, male; Half Orc Fighter, female; Human Monk, male; Moon Elf Rogue, female; Moon Elf Warlock, female; Silver Elf Wizard, male. This character played the monk. A pirate monk, specifically. This is important later. Although I hesitate to actually call him a monk. He was more like a fighter that lost his sword, his armor, and half of his hit points, and never bothered to try and get them back or buy new gear, and then started going around punching and hitting things with a quarterstaff. I say this because he almost never used any of his monk abilities and constantly ran headfirst into battle, Leroy Jenkins style, then threw a mini tantrum when his non-tank build, who ran ahead of the rest of the party, got knocked out within a round. We told him multiple times that he was dying because his build was not meant to be a frontline fighter, but he would always do the same thing in the very next encounter. Oftentimes when his character wasn't performing well, he would say something along the lines of, "Well, nobody told me that I had that ability," or "Nobody told me how to use that ability," as if it was our job to keep track of his character sheet. Monk was never satisfied unless he was actively doing something and actively saying something. Pretty much everything in the campaign had to just revolve around Monk, or he would whine about it, and then purposefully cause a commotion that forced the campaign to revolve around him again. He would also interrupt other players whenever he so pleased, but if they so much as dared to try and talk when he would yell at them, and then he would keep talking. Now, I do not think he wanted to be forcefully How could you not think that? How is that possible? Anyway, I just think that he did not understand that his character wasn't supposed to be actively involved in every single minute of gameplay. Unfortunately, no matter how many times we tried to tell him that he basically just had to wait his turn, he would still interrupt other players. Monk was also very into his character, and I mean genuinely, to an unhealthy degree. He was obsessed with his character. At first I was like, oh, that's nice, he's getting into character. But after a while, I was just like, Jesus, this guy is commenting about things that are happening outside of the game and attributing the quotes to his fictional character, and then trying to tell me I should learn from his said fictional character. This was not helped by the fact that throughout the campaign, everyone else went from not having an opinion on the character, to tolerating him, to just hating him. This is due to the fact that Monk, the character, is an obnoxious asshole who does whatever he wants even when the rest of the party tells him not to, and is constantly interrupting them and treating them like they are little more than extras in the Monk's show. Oh, and there are also some children playing in this game. It's a mixed age game. He is not one of these children, though I would certainly understand if you had your doubts. The youngest player is 11. This detail will be important later. The first major issue came in the middle of an adventure. I do not remember exactly what it was, but I think it was something pretty generic. After finishing a long rest at the castle we were staying in while serving an elf king, Monk tells us that his character does not leave the room until another character comes in to check on him. So Wizard, who is 13 in real life, keep that in mind, says he goes in to check on him. When Wizard enters the room, he finds Monk drunkenly crying with marks on his back, and he claims that it resulted from beating himself, like full-on physically beating himself with sort of a whip. Monk then starts an 8-minute long monologue that he clearly wrote beforehand about how hard his life is, how he loses himself in his drinks, and how he often wants to end it all. He did not discuss this with me beforehand, nor did I give him any sort of prompt that this was a good time to start having an in-character mental breakdown. It was in front of 3 literal children. I asked him about it later, and for some reason, it would seem as though Monk was expecting me to include themes of dystopia and desperation in the campaign that included real-life children as players, the youngest of which is 11 years old, and he was disappointed that I had not touched upon such concepts, and the interaction he had just created was an attempt to force the campaign that, I might remind you, has an 11-year-old girl as a player. To focus on themes of desperation, torture, abuse, and depression, 3 of our players call him out for how inappropriate it was for the children in the group via private message, and he stopped and apologized. This has not been an issue since, thank God. The next major issue came out when we were in the middle of an adventure where we had traveled back in time on accident after getting caught up in a wizard NPC spell. The adventure revolved around a group of recurring NPCs just at different points in their lives. It was the aforementioned Elf King, a Dwarf Prince, who was now King, and the Dwarf King, who is dead. To make a long story short, Elf King was a foster father for the Dwarf Prince because Dwarf King was emotionally abusive, and Elf King was upset because Dwarf King was coming to an upcoming banquet, and Dwarf King was always threatening that if Elf King ever made a wrong move, he would send Dwarf Prince to the abusive boarding school, which the party would later find out has a laundry list of dead children on their books before being shut down. Not knowing what to do and feeling very anxious about his son's well-being, Elf King spots our cleric and asks him that he can come pray with him in order to help him relieve his worries and get answers from the gods. Cleric obliges. Monk interrupts GM and Cleric mid-roleplay and says that his character is going to go try to break into the room where the prayer is happening. Now, supposedly, Monk is good aligned, but I guess his conscience doesn't dissuade him from trying to interrupt a distraught father who is praying with a trusted clergyman for his beloved son's well-being. So, with the rogue in tow, another 13-year-old girl by the way, he makes his way to the room where the cleric and Elf King are praying and is stopped at the door by the guards who inform him that the Elf King has requested privacy, and they should come back with whatever business they have later. The rogue nods and returns to the rest of the party. Monk, however, clearly has not had the wisdom that God gave a 13-year-old, because he takes out his sling, looks the guard in the face, who, unbeknownst to him, is actually a gold dragon, who is just in the shape of a hill dwarf, dead in the eye, and says,
"What would you do if I shot one of these here bullets at your head?"
Keep in mind, he is already a very sketchy looking pirate with tons of scars and tattoos, and he just made a pretty blatant threat against a hidden gold dragon protecting a high profile elf king. In any other campaign, that is when the dragon would have killed and eaten him, but because we had child players, there was no player character death, so instead, he is arrested and locked in the castle dungeon. I tried to move on from it, but Monk starts shouting obscenities and destroying anything he can get his hands on and roughing himself up, planning to later blame his injuries on the guards. This just causes said guards to further restrain him, but he continues shouting and making a huge scene and demands I allow him to make a strength check to break the restraints. I refuse, and he throws a slight tantrum about it. I ignore him and try to return to the game. When the other PCs find out he has been arrested, they head down to the dungeon to see if they can get him released. Dwarf Prince is with them, as Cleric was more or less trying to babysit him. They enter and see Monk in a wonderful state, and he is now writhing around on the floor as much as his restraints will allow him to, and still shouting obscenities. The rest of the party is laughing at him, not with him, at him, and the Dwarf Prince suggests to the Cleric that the monk deserves a spanking for throwing such a big tantrum. The Cleric chuckles, but responds that he is not the monk's guardian, and then makes sure to talk very loud for the monk to hear the long conversation with the Dwarf Prince about how the monk should be punished for behaving like that. Eventually the guards agree to release the monk, but he is not allowed to leave the guest room very often unless accompanied by multiple guards, and is not allowed within 20 feet of the Dwarf Prince, which reduces his participation in the coming adventure to watching the rest of the party do the crystal ball thing provided by the NPC wizard and talking to the other players via telepathy. This is not enough for him, and he throws another tantrum. The monk starts thrashing his room, resulting in him being arrested again. This time, the party barely even tries to get him out, and the monk starts swearing and breaking things again. The guards restrain him and gag him, and we do the rest of the session basically just trying to ignore the guy. The next issue came when the Cleric is getting married and invites the entire party to the wedding. After the ceremony, the monk gets drunk off his ass and starts hitting on a well-liked wizard NPC, the same one from before, who everyone knows is married, but whose husband isn't at the wedding. The wizard refuses, stating that he is married. This creep grabs the wizard by his wrist and says something along the lines of,
"Your husband doesn't have to know, it can be our little secret."
The wizard's refusing again. The monk asks again, this time telling the wizard how gorgeous he is. The wizard refuses. Again. I think the pattern of him pressuring the wizard into hooking up with him, and the wizard saying no, happened 2 more rounds, and it probably wouldn't have ended at all if the rest of the adult players didn't essentially start shouting, "No means no, man, leave him alone." He then danced with the wizard and felt the need to add he was
acting like a gentleman and not being handsy or anything.
Pro tip to all the guys out there, if you need to qualify that you aren't being handsy, you are probably not a gentleman. Keep in mind, this was at his character's friend's wedding. And oh yeah, aforementioned kids, 11 years old, god. The next and arguably biggest issue came when the monk sends me the following private message. It honestly should have been the final straw, but hindsight is 2020.
Speaking of my character Monk, not only is this campaign related necessarily, I was listening to one of my dad's CDs on Zen Buddhism as explained by some white guy, and think that Monk is a good embodiment of the spontaneity and thoughtlessness embraced by Zen. Zen emphasizes rigorous self-restraint, meditation practice, insight into the nature of mind, and favors direct understanding through spiritual practice and interaction with an accomplished teacher. He acts freely, ever shifting, and willing to adapt to the challenge. I'm not telling you to turn your legs into a pretzel and all that or anything, but I feel like you could learn something from that spontaneity. You seem to me to spend so much time planning things out the way you expect them to happen, and so carefully too, that when the player characters actually enter the picture, especially that drunk, they could derail all the hard work in a way that you did not expect. Perhaps you could take this as an opportunity to learn how to better adapt, to roll with the punches, as it were. As much as some of us wish for consistency, the one thing that's constant is change. And through both my own GMing experience and Buddhism, I'm learning to embrace that. If you're interested, we could make a silly little competition out of it. It could be like a modern role-playing game take on classic Eastern tale about the sword student and the master. The one in which the student is tasked with chores around a temple while the master randomly pops out to beat him with a stick.
Is that a kink or something? Anyway, so yeah, the monk basically told me that because I wasn't letting him derail the campaign so he could have his character do a bunch of crap that made everyone else uncomfortable and frustrated, I was not being adaptable, and that I should let him derail the campaign for the sake of Zen, as taught to him by some white dude CD on Buddhism. I didn't even know how to respond. How do you respond to a request that insane and insulting? Go away, find a different campaign to derail is probably what I should have wrote, but instead I tried to talk it out with him, and he promised to be better, but never actually changed. All of these behaviors continued until we told him that he had to take a break, create a new character, and follow certain criteria in order to continue playing, which included never mentioning his monk ever again. He agreed to our terms, but then the very next thing he sends me is a private message attempting to get me to do a roleplay with his monk that we just told him not to use again. I told him his monk is gone. We are not mentioning him anymore, and he kept trying to get me to do the roleplay he wanted to do, even though I expressly said I wasn't going to touch said monk. He said he needed to know what was wrong with the monk if he was going to fix the issue. And when I told him what the issue was, he ghosted me, assumably unable to comprehend that he could do any wrong or create an unlikable character, and upset with me for daring to tell him that his character he had do all of what I described was unlikable. I told him if he did not respond in 24 hours, he was permanently kicked, and was relieved when he never responded. Good riddance, and cue Michael Bublé's It's a Beautiful Day as I dance off into the sunset away from this dumpster fire of a player, and into a campaign where I do not have to deal with his crap. He then sent me an 8-page document critiquing my DM style and the 7 other players, who I had no issue with, by the way. I honestly hope he never plays again, because I wouldn't wish his ass on my worst enemy's D&D game. For some additional context, I am only 22 and was blindsided by how just bad this player was in general, and just did not know how to deal with him. I probably could have done better if I knew to, but dealing with such a player would be difficult for a 40-year-old, and I am barely old enough to legally drink in my country. We were perhaps all a bit too lenient with him, and all a bit too willing to give him another chance. But everyone was telling me to let him try to be better, because everyone felt bad for him and thought he was just working through some stuff, and the inappropriate for kids stuff only happened once and then ended immediately after he was told to stop, so it wasn't at the forefront of our minds, as it wasn't a persisting issue. It was a one-time WTF. Moments that legitimately never happened again. It also sounded a lot more extreme, all written out. In reality, it happened little by little, 1 week at a time over the course of about 3 months. This is going to be a long analysis, strap in. So, let's start with mental health subjects in Dungeons & Dragons. If everyone is on board, and I mean everyone, definitively knows what's going on and they are on board, they know what's happening, they know when it's happening, they're ready for it, then great. But I'm going to tell you very straightforward, mental health is a very incredibly difficult subject to tackle, possibly one of the most difficult. Everyone makes mistakes. Even my favorite depictions of mental health issues, such as PTSD, in films and in television. Even my most favorite depictions that are critically acclaimed, they are not perfect from a real-life psychology standpoint, because mental health is incredibly difficult to portray in fiction. No matter what you do, you're going to make mistakes. There is a great video by Hello Future Me that explains it. It is a long one, but it is linked in the cards. I totally recommend it. But yes, mental health is hard to depict, especially in a D&D game where everything is improv. Make sure everyone's on the same page. Clearly, in this case, not everyone was on the same page, and clearly this guy did not really think this through. I don't think it was a very mature look at a serious subject, and I think that if you're going to portray it in your game, you need to go at some length to do it respectfully, which is not what this player did. And more importantly, even than that, is to make sure everyone's on board. That is what's most important. Session 0, that's where you do it. Now, having kids in the game, I was kind of iffy on this. Like, first time I read this, I was like, why are there kids in this game? And I will stand by this position. Look, if you're running a game for kids, it's either all kids or kids with adults that they know. If it is random kids and random adults, I think you are setting up a disaster for yourself. I would not be comfortable running a game with random kids and random adults I have not met before. I don't think that's going to work out. It's either all kids or kids with adults that they know. That's my policy. If you have a different policy, that's on you. You do you, but that's how I think about that kind of situation, because I cannot imagine random kids and random adults working out. With the context, though, this story does make sense. While I was reading it, I was constantly thinking, like, why didn't they just kick this guy out? But they did what most RPG horror story channels and D&D advice channels recommend. Talk to the player first. They did. The DM and the players, they talked to the player first, the problem player, the monk. They talked to him, and he promised to improve, and for at least the mental health thing, he did improve. He changed, he never did it again, and yay, awesome. But later down the line, there was more worrying behavior that occurred over time, over a long period of time, and that is where things start to get really blurry. Because your mind doesn't think about the old stuff that happened a couple months ago, at least not usually, unless you harbor some kind of disdain for the guy. So yeah, overall, they did the right thing. They talked to the player and tried to get him to improve. But eventually, you need to cut your losses. You need to let it go. After the weird interactions with the wizard NPC, you're done. I do not think that the monk should be included in the game. After that, the mental health depiction at the beginning, even that, in my game, I would be very hesitant to let you return. But yeah, overall, this story has a lot of stuff in there. I hope you learned at least a couple lessons from it and enjoyed this video. Speaking of, if you guys enjoyed this episode of RPG Horror Stories and you want to let me know, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more episodes of this series, as well as my other content, then please do subscribe to Crispy's Tavern. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment, literal children, to let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.